July 13th, 1943, so 05:10 hours, south of Prokhorovka. A pale dawn crept over the rolling fields as Oberleutnant Karl Weiss stood half exposed in the open hatch of his Panzer IV OSF. Binoculars pressed to his eyes. A thin ground fog clung to the low wheat, blurring the horizon into a gray band broken only by a distant ridgeline. For several minutes the world appeared still. Then the ground began to vibrate. At first it was subtle. A deep rhythmic tremor felt through the soles of his boots rather than heard. Weiss lowered the binoculars, holding his breath, listening. The vibration grew stronger, resolving into the unmistakable sound of hundreds of engines running at high revolutions. At 05:12 hours, the first silhouettes appeared through the mist. Dark, angular shapes crested the ridge in a staggered line, their outlines sharpening as the sun rose behind them. Weiss did not need long to identify them. Sloped hulls, broad tracks, low turrets, T-34s, dozens at first glance, then scores, then more still emerging behind the first wave. They advanced not in a thin skirmish line, but in depth, multiple echelons spreading across nearly 5 kilometers of frontage. Behind them, Weiss could hear heavier engines, the slower, deeper note of KV-1s or assault guns following in support. At 05:15 hours, his radio crackled with a forward observer's report, the voice tight with urgency. Enemy armor advancing in strength, numbers estimated in the hundreds. Weiss felt a cold pressure settle in his chest. His regiment had expected Soviet counterattacks, but nothing on this scale. Not at dawn, not directly against a sector already stripped thin by days of fighting. He looked down the line of German tanks, 15 operational Panzer IVs in his company, fewer than 40 in the entire regiment. Many bore scars from the previous week, cracked Scherzen plates, patched optics, engines running hot after endless hours in dust and heat. At 05:20 hours, the fog thinned further, and Weiss saw the truth in full. The ridge seemed alive with armor. T-34s rolled forward in waves, their formations loose but purposeful, guns already firing as they descended. Tracers snapped through the haze, ricocheting off the hard earth. Soviet artillery began landing behind the German positions. Quick, shallow salvos designed to disorient rather than destroy. Weiss knew instantly that this was not a probing attack. It was a massed armored thrust, timed precisely to strike a regiment already exhausted and under strength. As the first shells began to whistle overhead, Weiss gripped the turret rim and understood that what he was watching was not simply a battle. It was the moment when individual skill, tactical finesse, and years of armored experience were about to collide with something far larger, an industrially generated wave of steel that did not need to be elegant to be decisive. Within 2 hours, his regiment would cease to exist. The path that brought Karl Weiss to that ridgeline outside Prokhorovka began long before Operation Citadel. Weiss had entered the Panzer Arm in the late 1930s, part of a generation trained in the belief that speed, coordination, and aggressive maneuver could offset numerical inferiority. He fought in Poland and France, where German armor achieved decisive breakthroughs against opponents slower to adapt. In 1941, he crossed into the Soviet Union with the Panzer III, participating in the sweeping encirclements that defined the opening months of Barbarossa. Those early campaigns reinforced a conviction shared by much of the German officer corps that well-trained crews and superior tactics could defeat larger enemy forces. But by 1943, the war on the Eastern Front had changed fundamentally. The Red Army that faced Weiss near Kursk was not the shattered force of 1941. It was an organization rebuilt around depth, redundancy, and production. Soviet factories relocated east of the Urals now produced tanks at a scale Germany could not match. In the first half of 1943 alone, Soviet industry turned out more than 12,000 tanks, the majority of them T-34s. Germany, under constant bombing and resource strain, produced fewer than 6,000. The disparity widened every month. Weiss's regiment, Panzer Regiment II of the 3rd Panzer Division, entered Operation Citadel already worn down by months of defensive fighting. On paper, it fielded close to 90 tanks. In reality, mechanical attrition, mine damage, and previous engagements reduced that number rapidly. Engines overheated, final drives failed, replacement parts arrived late, or not at all. By July 12th, after a week of continuous combat, fewer than half the regiment's tanks were operational. Ammunition stocks were adequate, but not abundant. Fuel deliveries were increasingly irregular as Soviet air attacks disrupted supply routes. Operation Citadel itself was conceived as a decisive blow, a limited offensive intended to pinch off the Kursk salient and destroy large Soviet formations. German planners committed their last strategic armored reserves, including newly issued Panther tanks and heavy Tiger battalions. But the Soviets knew the attack was coming. Intelligence from reconnaissance, radio intercepts, and partisan reports allowed them to construct layered defenses of unprecedented depth. Minefields kilometers wide, overlapping anti-tank gun belts, infantry trenches reinforced with concrete and timber. Every hour, the German advance slowed, allowed Soviet commanders to shift reserves closer to the threatened sectors. By July 12th, the southern pincer of the German attack approached Prokhorovka, where the 2nd SS Panzer Corps prepared to push through toward open ground. To counter this, the Soviet High Command committed the 5th Guards Tank Army, a formation built specifically for massed armored combat. It comprised several tank corps, each with hundreds of T-34s, supported by mechanized infantry, artillery, and engineers. Their mission was blunt and direct: smash the EU German armored spearhead, halt the offensive, and bleed it beyond recovery. Weiss was not facing the main weight of the 5th Guards Tank Army, but he was directly in the path of its supporting thrusts. His regiment occupied a sector intended to be overrun, not delicately engaged. The Soviet plan did not require careful preservation of armor. It required momentum. Losses would be replaced. Breakthrough mattered more than efficiency. On the night of July 12th, Weiss sensed something coming. Soviet artillery harassment increased after midnight. Reconnaissance reports hinted at armored concentrations east of the ridge, but German aerial observation was limited by smoke, dust, and Soviet air defenses. Luftwaffe support, once decisive, now arrived sporadically. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Experienced pilots were scarce. The balance of systems, air power, logistics, production, was tilting away from Germany. By Oro 300 hours on July 13th, Weiss was awake, inspecting his tanks in the dim light. Crews moved quietly, checking track tension, cleaning gun sights, loading 75mm rounds into ready racks. Each Panzer IV carried roughly 80 rounds, split between armor-piercing and high-explosive. Against a handful of enemy tanks, that was sufficient. Against waves, it was not. Weiss said little to his men. There was nothing useful to say. When the Soviet armor appeared at dawn, it did so with an inevitability that stripped away illusion. The first German shots, fired at ranges of 800 to 1,000 meters, knocked out several T-34s. Weiss's gunner worked calmly, adjusting aim, firing again and again. Smoke rose from burning Soviet tanks. For a few minutes, discipline and skill seemed to matter, but the gaps closed almost immediately. Where one T-34 burned, another rolled forward, then another. Soviet formations absorbed losses without slowing. The key difference revealed itself not in courage, but in structure. German tanks fought as individuals and small units, each kill hard-earned. Soviet tanks advanced as part of a system designed to continue regardless of losses. Communications were simpler, orders were direct, reserves followed closely behind the first wave. Artillery lifted just long enough for armor to surge through. As Weiss watched the field fill with enemy armor, he began to understand the larger reality. His regiment was not being defeated by superior tactics or individual skill. It was being erased by mass, by a production system capable of generating more tanks than any single defensive line could stop. The battle unfolding in front of him was not just about Prokhorovka. It was about the point at which German armored doctrine, perfected for short wars and rapid maneuvers, collided with an enemy fighting a war of industrial endurance. At 05:25 hours, as Soviet tanks closed to within 600 meters, and German radio nets filled with fragmented reports of penetrations along the flanks, Weiss realized that the next 2 hours would determine not only the fate of his regiment, but the future of Germany's ability to wage armored war in the east. The waves were coming, and there were too many to stop. Chapter 2. At 05:32 hours, the first Soviet tanks reached effective firing range, and the battle shifted from anticipation to irreversible motion. Weiss's Panzer IV shuddered as his gunner fired again, the long-barreled 75mm barking with practiced rhythm. A T-34 slewed sideways, flames licking from its engine deck, but the gap it left closed almost instantly. Soviet tanks did not pause to engage wrecks or assist damaged comrades. They drove around them, spreading laterally while maintaining forward pressure. Dust, smoke, and churned earth blurred individual vehicles into a continuous mass of movement. German radio traffic deteriorated rapidly. At 05:37 hours, Weiss heard fragmented calls from the left flank, reports of Soviet armor breaking through, of panzer crews abandoning immobilized tanks, of anti-tank guns being overrun before they could be repositioned. The regiment's right flank responded with concentrated fire, knocking out several attackers at 700 meters, but Soviet artillery answered immediately. Short, violent barrages crashed down behind the German line, severing withdrawal routes and smashing ammunition trucks that had been pulled forward overnight. By 05:45 hours, the Soviet second wave entered the fight. Weiss recognized the pattern with growing dread. The first echelon absorbed losses and fixed German fire. The second passed through, exploiting gaps, while a third gathered behind the ridge, engines running, waiting to be committed. This was not the chaotic armor rushes of 1941 or 1942. It was a deliberate application of mass, shaped by doctrine and sustained by logistics. Each Soviet tank brigade advanced with the expectation that many vehicles would be lost, but that enough would survive to continue the advance regardless. Weiss's company destroyed at least 10 T-34s in the first 20 minutes. The gunner's voice remained calm as he called out ranges and corrections. But ammunition racks were emptying quickly. By 0558 hours, Weiss had already expended more than half of his armor-piercing rounds. The loader's movements slowed as sweat and smoke filled the turret. Outside, the battlefield no longer resembled a line of engagement. It had become a series of overlapping penetrations, Soviet tanks weaving between burning wrecks and advancing directly toward command posts, artillery batteries, and supply vehicles. At 0602 hours, a Soviet tank platoon broke through on the regiment's right, bypassing German armor entirely and pushing toward the rear. Weiss turned his tank to engage, but the maneuver exposed his flank. A T-34 fired on the move, the 76 mm round striking Weiss's Panzer IV low on the hull. The shell failed to penetrate fully, but cracked a suspension arm, jolting the tank violently. The driver shouted that steering was impaired. Weiss ordered him to keep moving, knowing that a stationary tank was a dead tank. The regimental commander attempted to regroup surviving elements around a shallow ridgeline at 0610 hours, but the order came too late. Soviet tanks were already among the German positions, firing at point-blank range. One Panzer IV burst into flames as a T-34 rammed it after firing. Another German tank, engine stalled, was abandoned as its crew fled under machine gun fire. Weiss watched through his optics as Soviet infantry dismounted from tanks and began clearing foxholes with grenades and submachine guns, ensuring no German anti-tank teams could regroup. The decisive realization came to Weiss at approximately 0620 hours. He had always believed that superior tactics could offset inferior numbers if applied decisively at the right moment. But here, there was no decisive moment to seize. Every tactical success was swallowed by the scale of the assault. Destroying 5 tanks meant nothing when 50 more followed. Each German loss was irreplaceable in the short term. Each Soviet loss was expected, planned for, and already accounted for in reserve strength. At 0633 hours, Weiss's Panzer IV took another hit, this time from the side at less than 300 meters. The shell penetrated the hull behind the Schutzen plate, killing the radio operator instantly and igniting stored ammunition. Weiss ordered immediate evacuation. Smoke filled the turret as the driver forced open his hatch. Weiss dropped to the ground, rolling into a shallow depression as the tank erupted in flames behind him. His company was effectively finished. From the ground, Weiss saw the battlefield with a clarity he had not known from inside the turret. German armor lay scattered in small, isolated groups. Burning wrecks, immobilized hulks, abandoned machines. Soviet tanks moved past them without hesitation, their attention fixed forward. The battle was no longer about destroying the regiment. That had already happened. It was about continuing the advance. By 0645 hours, the regiment's command vehicle was destroyed, and organized resistance collapsed entirely. Survivors attempted to withdraw on foot, using shell holes and burning tanks as cover. Weiss regrouped with a handful of men from other crews, all shaken, all aware that their unit no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Soviet tanks rolled past at intervals of seconds, their engines roaring, their crews focused on the next objective rather than the wreckage behind them. At 0700 hours, the main Soviet thrust pushed beyond Weiss's former position, heading deeper toward German rear areas. The 2-hour window was closing. The regiment that had entered the morning with nearly 40 operational tanks now had fewer than 5 still capable of movement. Those remaining were pulling back independently, lacking fuel, ammunition, or orders. The ground they had defended was lost beyond recovery. As the sound of engines receded slightly, Weiss sat in the dirt, helmet pushed, back, staring at the devastation. He counted at least 30 destroyed German tanks within a kilometer radius. He also counted far more destroyed Soviet tanks. But the difference no longer mattered. The Soviets had achieved their objective. The German armored line had been erased. The lesson crystallized with brutal clarity. The Red Army was no longer attempting to outfight German armor in a contest of skill. It was overwhelming it through scale, tempo, and replacement capacity. Soviet factories in the Urals would replace the tanks lost that morning within days. German factories, strained by bombing and shortages, would not replace Weiss's regiment at all. By mid-morning, German High Command recognized that Operation Citadel had failed. The armored reserves committed to the offensive were exhausted or destroyed. The Red Army seized the initiative across the Eastern Front. For Weiss, the war had changed permanently in those 2 hours south of Prokhorovka. The era of the Panzer ace, the belief that experience and tactical brilliance could compensate for material inferiority, ended not with a dramatic last stand, but with the relentless advance of an enemy whose strength lay not in individual tanks, but in the system that produced and replaced them. Courage had not been absent. Skill had not been lacking, but neither could stop an industrial tide. Thank you for watching this World War II story. Like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.